And I'm so glad to be here with you and see so many familiar faces when we talk about this important topic. So we're going to do a lot of discussion today about kind of future looking, how we work together, how we can pull resources together and share resources and information to better serve Kansans. But before we do that, I wanted to welcome our Attorney General, Derek Schmidt. He's my boss, and we're glad he's here. He's very passionate about this issue, so we thought it'd be great if you all could hear from him himself. So welcome, General.
Hi, Gina. Thanks. And hello, everybody. I think I don't know if we've mastered the technology yet, but surely 6 months into COVID, we at least can generally use it. And we're glad to have it. So I don't have any long speech. I just want to thank all of you for taking time to do this. I am really excited that you're making this happen. Some of you have worked on suicide prevention and related issues for many, many years. And I know that I'm late to the game in that sense, but it's something that we've focused on from our corner of the world now for several years. We had, from the Attorney General's office standpoint, our ad hoc task force we did with the Tower Mental Health Foundation. It's been almost 3 years ago now, looking specifically at youth suicide issues in the state. They came up with a number of recommendations, and some of that was enacted into statute, including the provision that directed us to essentially to hire Gina. I didn't mention her, but to create the youth suicide coordinator position, and we're really delighted that she's engaged on this and been willing to represent that piece of it. One of the big pictures I think that came out of when we took our look from our perspective was that there is so much good work going on out and around in communities in the state, but it is so uneven. And there are communities that are absolutely, they've got all the parts connected, they've got all the multidisciplinary folks in their community engaged, and they're focused in like a laser. And then there are other communities where that just isn't so, and everything in between. And so we thought maybe one of the things that would really add some value would be not to reinvent the wheel and not to presume that we had some type of insight that others haven't previously discovered, but just to try to act to support convening these sorts of conversations among the folks that are already laboring in the vineyards, to make sure that everybody's pulling the same direction. And so when you all decided to make this happen, put together this inaugural meeting for the Prevention Coalition, I really was, perhaps not quite giddy, but I really was very excited about it, because I think it has the potential to be a real force multiplier, for lack of a better metaphor, for the many good efforts that are already ongoing. I know it can get frustrating after a while, especially when resources ebb and flow, and sometimes you can access what you need and sometimes it's just not there. That's not, let's be honest, that's not going to change. That's the reality of working in the world, and certainly in the public sector. But I think we can perhaps do a better job of supporting each other, interconnecting resources, providing some throw weight, if you will, and really trying to smooth out the hills and valleys, not just on money, but also on everybody gets tired. And so we can support each other as we work through these things and learn from each other. So, today I've taken a look at some of what's coming. I know that you're going to talk about or hear about, depending on your vantage point, what some of the state agencies and some of the major partners already are doing. I think that's a great place to start. Again, no need to reinvent the wheel. But I hope this is the start of an ongoing collaboration under this umbrella of the coalition. We want to be full partners at the AG's office and support everybody else in the work that they're doing. And Gina will be our principal liaison. We'll be engaged across the board, but obviously, because the statute tells us, we will be principally engaged on the youth suicide prevention issues. That's a legal obligation that we have now. And so that'll be sort of job one in terms of the voice that we'll bring to the table through Gina. One last thing I might say on that, not to end on a down note, but just so you know, one of the things that got us engaged here on our watch a handful of years ago was having looked at the data on youth suicide trends in Kansas over a period of years. We have, since long before I got to serve in this position, the Attorney General's office has housed the State Child Death Review Board. It's a terrific group of multidisciplinary professionals who every year go through the available information for every death of a child under the age of 18 in Kansas. They try to identify trends, lessons learned, they make recommendations, and of course the goal is to be better off going forward in terms of saving kids' lives than we were looking backwards. And they've done a great job on that. But one of the disturbing trends has been both the absolute numbers and the rate of youth fatality by suicide in Kansas. And as we look back over that over about a decade, the trend line thankfully was not sharply up, but unfortunately it was steadily up. And I can tell you we'll be publishing the 2018, we're always 2 years behind on the data because of the way that the data collection and review works. But the Child Death Review Board will be publishing its 2018 data review shortly, I hope maybe even next week. And it is going to show that in 2018, once again, the trend line was up. The good news, if we're looking for a silver lining, is that the rate was not up as sharply as it was between 2015, 16, and 17. But unfortunately, it's still up and not down. So we have our work cut out for us, and I'll stop talking and just I thank everybody for lending your talents and efforts to this collaboration, and we're excited about it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, General. I am just going to give a couple more logistic updates before we fully jump in. Go ahead and make sure you keep yourself muted during the speakers today unless they ask for some feedback or to hear your voice. We do, however, want to hear from you in the chat, so make sure you utilize the chat box, put in your questions. We will be keeping track of those to follow up with. Either today during the meeting, or if we don't have time, we will follow up with them after the meeting. The PowerPoint today will be shared through email after the meeting, as well as any files that I share during the chat box, or in the chat box. I'll share some files throughout today's meetings, but we'll also share those in an email afterwards. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Chad. Okay, here is an overview of today's agenda, and we will take a short break around 3 o'clock, but feel free to get up and take care of yourself as needed. And on the next slide, Chad. All right, we want to know where you're joining from, who you are, and what organization you're with. So go ahead and type in the chat box your name, organization, and then what your role is with suicide prevention in Kansas. And we know many of you are a part of many different parts of suicide prevention, but go ahead and just put what's your primary role with suicide prevention in Kansas for today's meeting's purposes. So go ahead and type that in the chat. All right, great. And as you guys continue to share this in the chat, we will be following back up about roles in Kansas and who's here in the meeting. So make sure that you put your name in the chat so we know that you're here. Awesome, thank you. Lots of great people from across Kansas joining us today. And even from Ohio. All right, thank you guys. I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to Commissioner Brown.
Hi, everybody. My name is Andy Brown. I'm the Commissioner for Behavioral Health Services at KDADS. And I wanted to try and just provide a little purpose overview from the state perspective. And I've got some notes I'm going to be reading, but one of the things that I kind of wanted to just say up front is that having a statewide coalition is something that is kind of a key step in helping us develop infrastructure here in the state to support suicide prevention, both at the local level and the state level. And one of the things that I think is important to know is just that we've spent a lot of time kind of working through processes in order to develop and get to the point where we are today, where we're trying to launch this coalition. And my hope is that some of you that are on the call today will be excited enough about this opportunity that you'll want to volunteer to be on a steering committee to help us shape the coalition and make decisions about its future. So with that said, let me bounce over to my notes. But that suicide is a complex problem that's going to require ongoing solutions implemented across many sectors of society. And in Kansas, the task of leading those suicide prevention efforts is spread across a number of state agencies that cooperate together with multiple providers and groups in various communities across the state. Consistent with our recently revised state plan that you guys all had the opportunity to review, we're gathering here today to start this conversation about how we're going to work together more effectively. So our aim is to try to create as diverse as possible a statewide coalition that is truly representative of all corners of the state and that can ensure that suicide prevention gets the attention it deserves, as well as provide ongoing feedback and support to existing local efforts. The Kansas Statewide Suicide Prevention Coalition is being developed in a joint effort of multiple state departments, offices, with collaboration from WSU's Community Engagement Institute, the Kansas Prevention Collaborative, local suicide prevention coalitions and organizations, and people with lived experience related to suicide. So there are some strategic directions that are highlighted that I kind of want to go over. The first one is for number one, healthy and empowered individuals, families, and communities. So the state's purposes of the coalition that connect back to this strategic direction include, but are not necessarily limited to, the following. So for goal one, we want to integrate and coordinate suicide prevention activities across multiple sectors and settings. So in order to truly impact the lives of Kansans and to improve support available to those affected by suicide or suicide attempts, it's necessary for this plan to identify a multifaceted, comprehensive lifespan approach to suicide prevention. So by building a statewide suicide prevention coalition that represents both public and private sectors, that will provide opportunities for these partners to align their suicide prevention efforts and implement best practices. So multiple state agencies have responsibilities and opportunities to advance suicide prevention efforts through our regulatory and service provision work. Increased collaboration amongst these agencies is key to achieving suicide safety for the people of Kansas. And some of the most important voices in shaping suicide prevention efforts are and will be the people that are with lived experience of suicide attempts, thoughts, and loss. These individuals must be included in all levels of our suicide prevention planning in order to ensure that the work that is guided by their wisdom and addresses their needs. Suicide prevention coalitions and organizations across Kansas bring passionate people together to discuss suicide and take action. Other coalitions make suicide a priority, such as those with a mental health, public health, early childhood, problem gambling, substance abuse prevention focus. And these are all parts of our communities that formally engage in suicide prevention alongside families, religious communities, and workplaces. Establishing a statewide prevention coalition will help us empower Kansans to connect with suicide prevention efforts currently underway, further the knowledge that representation from multiple sectors and communities improve prevention, and input from diverse sectors can help address suicide, including health, education, social services, justice, policy, and private sector. By building partnerships and effective collaborations impacting each level of society to prevention. So a state interagency work group of statewide partners assures that the effective use of resources, consistent and comprehensive messaging, and a shared vision of initiatives. So Now let me jump back over here to these other slides real quick. So when you were looking at this slide, which was put together by our friends over at KDHE, you can see that there's a lot of activity going on around the state. So we have the Governor's Behavioral Health Services Planning Council here at KDADS. Its role is to help advise our mental health services planning here in the state and with KDADS. And within that group, we have the Prevention Subcommittee. And within the subcommittee, we have a Suicide Prevention Work Group. Additionally, we have the Attorney General's Youth Suicide Prevention Advisory Council. And we have the Zero Suicide and Health Systems Grant over at KDHE. And those three groups are things that we are going to continue to work on moving forward with responsibility around suicide prevention. But we want to bring those all together along with our community partners around the state by forming the statewide Suicide Prevention Coalition. So you can see that in the center of the graph. So what we're hoping to do is to build upon a lot of the work that's happened in the last 2 years, right? So we've had our Suicide Prevention State Action Plan work group that's been meeting to work on the plan. We've got our SPRC Infrastructures and Communities of Practice that's been meeting for the last 6 months, 9 months. We've got our Governor's Challenge to Prevent Suicide Among Service Members and Veterans work group, which started about a year and a half ago. And then we've got our state agencies collaborating to improve youth and prevent suicide work group, which is an interagency group that has been working specifically on youth suicide issues. So we want to combine those groups and the work that they've done, the planning that they've accomplished, and kind of centralize all of that work around this coalition. And then within the coalition, we're anticipating that there will probably be a need for a subcommittee that focuses on youth suicide prevention and another one that focuses on adults. But that's kind of our general layout and anticipation of what we're trying to do here today. So we can go to the next slide too. So this one's just a little bit simpler. It shows, I think, kind of how those kind of shrink down a little bit. Go to the next one. Okay, so we've included these slides because these slides have a little bit more detail about each of the different groups and what they've worked on and how they've functioned in the past. And there's 4 that are listed here. The SPRC Infrastructure Communities of Practice is the group that has been meeting with the SPRC to really kind of look at and review what the guidelines are for state infrastructure development. And the number one thing that they suggest doing, like the very first phase of their toolkit, right, their getting started guide, is for us to convene a state suicide prevention coalition and then have that coalition work on the next 4 steps or phases. And so I want to just recognize everybody for the work that they've done on these various groups. And I think there's another slide on the list of groups here. But all of these folks have been working, and there's a lot of cross collaboration, right? A lot of people have served on multiple groups affiliated with this. And we're going to be trying to find ways for us to really kind of pull some of this work together and centralize it. That was one of our main hopes. But then also look at what role that the statewide coalition could have in helping shape future endeavors here in the state, and also help us build infrastructure so that we have a more robust suicide prevention strategy here in Kansas. And with that, I think I could try to answer a few questions if we've still got time remaining, or somebody can flag me and tell me I'm out of time.
Oh, we have a couple minutes. If you have any questions for Andy, go ahead and put them in the chat box. All right, anything else, Commissioner Brown?
I've got
Yeah,
one.
sorry. Okay, so I would say that this is very exciting for me. I think the first time I started talking to people around the state about forming a statewide coalition was probably 5 or 6 years ago, um, and that was before I worked at the state. But I do feel like we've come a long way, and we are definitely ready to try and make the next step in this. So, and Gary, I see your message about the VA. We did invite the VA to this meeting, and they have been involved in our Governor's Challenge team and helped develop the plan for suicide prevention for the SMBF population. So they'll be included certainly in future work as we move forward.
And you do have one other question. How does this fit with the SAMHSA grant that KDHE was awarded for zero suicide?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak too much for KDHE, but I do believe that their hope is that this coalition would help serve as their advisory council for zero suicide down the road, and that we would also provide support and integration with that grant project, and possibly future grants if we get those too. All right, well, there's no other questions. I just wanted to again share, like, it's very exciting for me. I'm looking forward to us being able to actually get together in a room sometime and talk about suicide prevention. But I feel like this is going to be the beginning of something pretty significant for the state, and I'm looking forward to the progress that we can make in building our infrastructure. So I will turn it over to our next presenter.
All right, our next presenter, we have Shauna joining us from the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. So Shauna, do you have capability to go ahead and share your screen?
I think so. First, is my voice coming through okay? Can you hear me all right? All right, awesome.
It is.
All right, I will tap share screen here. Okay. All right, and I believe you should be seeing a PowerPoint slide. Is that what you're saying? Okay. And really quick, it took away the chat box, which I'd like to have the chat box up because, I'm not sure how to get the chat box back up.
It might be at the top of your screen. If there's a little black bar, there might be 3 extra
There
dots.
we go.
Okay.
Thank you, Janelle. That was helpful. Because I was going to say, I want to be able to see if people have questions. So I got my chat box up now. All right. So, yeah, thank you so much for having me. Some of your faces I recognized from a planning call I got to have about a month ago. Some of you, this is my first time, I know. I am a senior prevention specialist from the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. And in that role, I get to support a portfolio of states and communities across the U.S. in implementing what is called a public health approach to suicide prevention. So Kansas is one of those states. It's been exciting to see a lot of the work that Kansas has been doing, in particular around the community of practice. I've gotten to be a part of that with them. And just kudos to you for all of the work that you are doing in your state. A little bit more about me that I just wanted to share is that what I'm talking about today is actually a huge passion area of mine. I work now at the national level, but formerly I used to work at both the community level and the state level in suicide prevention. So I started out at a very young age, at about 20, being involved in my first county level suicide prevention coalition because we had a cluster of youth suicides at the time. I was living in Illinois then, but at that young age, I really saw the role that communities can play. Since then, I've also worked at the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation. I was a program director there. I got to oversee our state's Garrett Lee Smith grant and other work like that. But my favorite part of that job was supporting our state's county suicide prevention coalitions. We had over 40 of them in our state at the time, and then also helping get to form our first statewide coalition. So I've been through this process. I know it's a lot of work. I'm really passionate about suicide prevention, which you can probably tell, but I'm also really passionate about the role of coalitions. So I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about this today. Just a little fun thing I have on the screen here, that is a photo of me and my husband from earlier this year before the pandemic went into effect. I wanted to do something informal like that because I want you to feel comfortable asking questions today. I have the slide set up so that the questions won't all be housed at the end. Instead, I have a couple places where we can hopefully have some Q&A where it's more natural with the topics that are at hand. So with that all being said, I'll go ahead and get us started. I can get my screen to switch. Okay. So I have to have this slide up. I work for SPRC. SPRC is funded through SAMHSA, but these opinions are my own. They are not necessarily SAMHSA's. All right, so today what we are going to be talking about is state suicide prevention infrastructure, and particularly the role that coalitions can play in that. Before we talk about the role of coalitions, I wanted to take just a few minutes to highlight what those state suicide prevention infrastructure recommendations are, for those of you who might be really kind of hearing about this concept for the first time. So the SPRC released the state suicide prevention infrastructure recommendations in fall of last year. So they are just about at their 1-year anniversary right now. And these recommendations were based on research and collaboration with stakeholders from across the U.S. looking at what is it that we need to do in the U.S. to make suicide prevention work at the state level more sustainable. And so these infrastructure recommendations provide 6 essential elements. You can see them in the image on the right side of the slide. And those essential elements are supposed to be core things we need to get in place in our state to have sustainable, impactful, and effective suicide prevention. Now, the link that I have on this slide here, I do encourage you to check it out if this is your first time hearing about them, because I'm going to be doing a broad overview today, and there's a lot of great information there. So to go a little bit more into these 6 essential elements, the 6 essential elements for state suicide prevention infrastructure, what you should notice about them almost right away is that they're all verbs. And this is intentional because it's really supposed to lay out actions that we need to take to build that infrastructure within our state. So within each one of these 6 essential elements, there are also recommendations. So that's where the recommendation point comes in. And those recommendations really lay out, this is what you have to do to achieve each essential element. If you get the recommendations in place, you've gotten the essential elements in place. For those of you who might be kind of public health geeks, I really like to look at the recommendations as objectives, and the essential elements as kind of like our goals. For the purpose of what I'm going to be doing today as we think about the role of coalitions in state infrastructure development, I'm really going to be focusing on the authorized, lead, and partner essential elements. And this isn't because the other 3 essential elements aren't important or because coalitions don't play a role in them. They absolutely do long term. But when we're first looking at developing infrastructure and forming that first statewide coalition, it's these first 3 essential elements that are really key. All right, so what I want to do as we kind of look at this is look at authorized, lead, and partner in depth so we can have that background as we talk about the role of coalitions, or rather before we get to the role of coalitions. Now, the authorized essential element is our very first one, and it really focuses on having the presence of a lead agency to guide suicide prevention in the state. As I go through each of these, you're going to see that there's going to be bullet points, and those bullet points represent the recommendations. The green star bullet points are the base recommendations that we recommend we have to get in place to be able to achieve this recommendation. The plus recommendations that you'll see at the bottom of each of these slides are supposed to represent higher level recommendations. So they're things that we don't focus on right away, but we focus on them more long term. So I don't overwhelm everyone right now. Let's look at the first three first. With these first three recommendations, it's pretty straightforward, I think, when it comes to authorized, but even though it's straightforward, this is, of course, a hard one to achieve when we're looking at getting this in place the first time. First, we want to designate who our lead division or organization is. Now, when we think about this, ideally, we want it to be formally, so that means there could be an executive order saying the Department of Health or KDADS is going to be our lead agency for suicide prevention, or there's going to be legislation passed saying we need to have this lead agency. Well, that doesn't always happen. In a lot of states, it's really hard to get things passed through that formal route. So maybe you have a lead agency that becomes a lead agency because it's recognized for its skill, its expertise, and the fact that it has the capacity to actually be the lead agency in the state. Beyond that, another key thing that people can get kind of tripped up on when it comes to authorized is this concept of who should be the lead agency. And that really differs from state to state. In a lot of states, the most common ones are Departments of Mental Health or whatever the equivalent is there, or the Department of Public Health, but it can be any government agency, and it can even be a private agency. In the state of Ohio, when I worked at the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation, we were actually the lead agency for suicide prevention in the state, even though we were a nonprofit. So it really does differ from state to state. What's right is always up to the state at hand. After we've designated who that lead division or organization is, of course we have to give them funding. And this is a lot harder said than done. We all know that we need funding. This can come through budget line items. It can come through foundation or federal grants we can apply for. It can come from the use of block grants. But we want that funding to support our lead agency. Another key part of authorized, and this is something that I've seen you guys are already working on in Kansas, is putting together a state suicide prevention plan and looking at what are the directions, what is the guidance we need for suicide prevention in our state. And then these are deeply connected to the more high-level recommendations, but they really just build off of them. So in authorized, we really want to make sure that whoever our lead agency is, they're given the authority to see that that state plan is actually carried out, that it doesn't just sit on a shelf somewhere. And then beyond that, we also, in an ideal world, are going to be given the opportunity to give our state leaders regular updates on what is going on in suicide prevention. And ideally, connecting that back to our state plan, letting them know what progress we are or not making. So that's authorized in a nutshell. After authorized, we have the lead essential element. And with lead, I like to look at it really as this is the staff, these are the resources that make up our lead agency. So the first recommendation is that we want to have at least one full-time dedicated position to suicide prevention in the state. And in some states, they have like 6 people who have full-time money set aside for them to just be able to do suicide prevention. I did not come from a state where that was the case. And there's a lot of states who don't even have one full-time person dedicated to this right now. So this is a recommendation we want to have, that every state has one dedicated leadership position in that lead agency, focusing on nothing but suicide prevention. It's not 0.5% of their time, but it's 100% of it. After we get that funding, that support for that leadership position, we also can focus on identifying other core staff positions that we need to have, because suicide prevention can't be done by just one person in that lead agency alone, as well as looking at what other administrative items we need, having webinar platforms, having office space, et cetera. And then we also want to make sure that we're looking at that lead agency in its ability to respond to information requests. So if, for example, there's a death by suicide that's high profile in your state, if there's news that's going out, they know to turn to that lead agency, and that lead agency is able to get information out in response to the information requests that are coming in. The media, the state leaders, they know who to turn to. And then when we look at this with our higher level recommendations, I like to group the first 2 here kind of together. First and foremost, it's about establishing formal connections between the relevant government divisions. And I say let's connect to the next one because it's about integrating programs across funding sources. At the heart of these two things is this idea that we're going to have a lead agency for suicide prevention, but it's not going to be operating in isolation. And we know that if we're really going to prevent suicide, we have to have a lot of different community sectors involved, which means we need to have a lot of different government agencies involved as well. So looking at how we can have formal collaborations across our different government agencies that are all contributing to our suicide prevention work. And then also we want to build our staff capacity to effectively communicate. It's pretty straightforward with that one, but the idea of our staff in that lead agency feel like they can go out and they can talk about suicide prevention effectively. All right, and then lastly, we have partner. Now, those first two, you might be sitting there thinking, how on earth is this connected to a statewide coalition? I promise I will get to that. This one is flat out, it's about the statewide coalition. So with a partner essential element, its recommendation first and foremost is that we form a statewide coalition, as Andy kind of alluded to earlier. And it's important that that statewide coalition gives equal weight to our private and public partners in the state so that we don't just have the public agencies serving as leaders, but our private agencies are leading that coalition as well. And then when we look at this a little bit further, what's really important is how we form the statewide coalition, making sure that our partners come together to have a shared vision and language, and also over the long term that those partners who are part of that statewide coalition are feeling like they're getting something out of it, and that that coalition at this lead agency, we're supporting our partners and their ability to address suicide prevention within their own agencies, within their own systems, within their own policies. And then lastly, it's really important when we form a statewide coalition that we ask people to commit to it. That we don't just say you can come and go as you want, but there's formal agreements saying I'm going to be committed, I'm going to be on for this X amount of time, I'm going to engage in these roles. So that's the idea behind partner. Just to put this kind of in greater perspective, there are 3 additional essential elements. I'm not even going to cover them here because of time, but again, coalitions are key to all of this. Really what we're focusing on today is that authorized lead and partner side of things. All right, so I felt like this was kind of a natural place for us to be able to answer any questions. After this, we'll switch to more of the coalition side of things, but I wanted us to have this foundation around the infrastructure. And if there's any questions on like developing this infrastructure or what it means, I'm happy to answer them now. And I'm making sure I have the chat up so I can see. Well, I'm not seeing anything coming into the chat, so hopefully that means that what I'm sharing is making sense. Feel free to tell me if it doesn't at any point in time. All right, so keep going here. There we go. All right, so as we flip to specifically discussing statewide coalitions, I wanted to start by kind of looking at what is the purpose of coalitions before we get into their connection with state infrastructure. We know at the end of the day, the entire purpose of any statewide coalition, whether it's suicide prevention or anything else, is to bring together stakeholders to create a common vision and a shared ownership for addressing whatever the prevention issue is. And what I really like to emphasize is that when it comes to coalitions at the state level, they do this by just really providing us with a mechanism for things that we already know we should be doing. When it comes to coalitions, we know we should be communicating between community sectors. We know that we should be engaging in strategic planning. Coalitions gives us the partnerships, the opportunity to bring people together to really do this so it doesn't happen in isolation just with one agency on its own. With that kind of in mind, I have this slide here kind of looking at the benefits of statewide coalitions. And I wanted to look at the benefits as being both for states as well as for the communities who make up that statewide coalition. And when I talk about communities here, and this is going to be true throughout this, communities obviously are that obvious thing of regional communities, cities, counties, our rural, or urban, or suburban communities. But communities are also, in this case, are different community stakeholders. So we're thinking about our healthcare sector, we're thinking about our school sector, all of those different community sectors, the businesses, the private agencies that we want to make sure are having their voices heard. And so when we look at it from that standpoint, there really are kind of 2 different groupings of the benefits that I wanted to have here. I'm not going to read each one of these bullet points, but first and foremost, when it comes to statewide coalitions, they benefit the states because they give them an understanding of what the different community needs are and what needs are unique to the different communities, as well as what needs are across the board, are common across a lot of different communities. And when the state knows that, it gives them an understanding of where they need to focus their funding, their resources, which we know are always too limited when it comes to mental health and suicide prevention. But it also gives them an understanding of what it is and is not going to work in addressing them. Because in order for the state to be able to give support to communities effectively, they have to be in conversations with them. And of course, statewide coalitions provide the opportunity for that direct connection between our different communities and our state agencies or state representatives. And I don't want it to be seen as there just being benefits for the state here. When it comes to that community level, it doesn't just give you a seat at the table. It also gives you the opportunity to really express what your local needs actually are. And when you're looking at data and everything, if you're sitting at these coalition tables, it gives you the opportunity to explain why the data is showing what the data is showing. It lets you say, you know what, this is going to work or this isn't going to work. You're considering that strategy, but it's not going to fly in our community because of our culture, our policies, these politics that are existing at the local level. The state doesn't know that unless they're getting that feedback from you. And when you can give them that feedback, it allows you to get the most support and resources that you can from them in the best way. Looking at beyond that when it comes to our benefits, I kind of grouped the other three at the bottom separately, but they're really connected because when we're engaging in these conversations, it does allow us to have that across community sector buy-in for a common vision and purpose for suicide prevention in the state. And when we're doing that at the state level, we can plan, implement, and evaluate our efforts so much better. And this benefits the communities as well because, again, as you're forming that common vision, you're naturally sharing what you're doing in your communities that other communities might not know about. You're letting people know what your resources, your programs are so that you can learn from one another, learn strategies, and even pull other resources from other communities that they may have developed and use them in your own communities. So it's really a win-win for everyone if a coalition is functioning well for people to be able to be involved in it. All right. So with kind of that structure of this is why we want coalitions in place, the natural transition that I have here is just looking at the role of coalitions in developing the infrastructure related to those first three essential elements, the authorized lead and partner essential elements. So kind of keeping in mind what we discussed earlier, something we emphasized about authorized is that its entire purpose is to get a lead agency in place for suicide prevention. And what we know when it comes to authorize is that we want to make sure that whoever that lead agency is going to be providing support to the statewide coalition and receiving feedback from them in some format. So this does differ greatly from state to state. In our state in Ohio, when we formed our first statewide coalition, our lead agency, the Ohio Suicide Prevention Foundation, limited itself as providing direct administrative backing. We provided a meeting spot for the coalition members. We provided the webinar platform to meet virtually. We provided meeting minutes and literally did the administrative stuff, but we did not serve in any leadership roles on the coalition itself. In other states, they do that differently. For example, in Indiana, their Department of Mental Health really is seen as a lead agency for the coalition. And sometimes that is explicitly laid out that the lead agency is going to be the leader of the coalition. What's right or wrong, of course, completely differs from one state to another. What is important is that there are close ties between the two so that that statewide agency, as it's making decisions on what needs done in suicide prevention in the state, is receiving that guidance, the knowledge from the coalition. And then in addition to this, another key part of Authorize is state plans and making sure that we have a state plan in place. So when it comes to the coalition's role in this, they can really be involved in whatever level a state wants, but what we often see when it comes to the best state plans is a statewide coalition that has helped to develop them. So sometimes the statewide coalition serves as a planning committee itself. Sometimes you might not have your entire statewide coalition involved in that planning committee, but you might help coordinate it by having a subcommittee that's your state planning subcommittee, or putting out a call to the wider state saying, hey, we want people who want to give us input on what our state plan should be. And what's also really important is making sure that our statewide coalition is providing input on what's going into the state plan and whether or not it's being achieved over time. And so we see this being done sometimes with states having quarterly meetings set aside where they just discuss, we've had our state plan in place for 6 months or a year now. Are we making progress in achieving it? And having those discussions with a statewide coalition, you can identify what you might need to change, what you might want to keep doing, and what's going well or not going well. The statewide coalition really needs to play a key part in that evaluation, because with your diversity of people, you have great input on what's actually working and not. So that's authorized and how coalitions are really key to that. When we look at LEAD, even though this one might seem like how on earth is it connected to coalitions, we also see it as being deeply connected, because again, it comes down to thinking about those connections between what LEAD calls for and what coalitions provide. In some states, when we look at LEAD, we know that they have staff who actually have it written into their position descriptions that they're going to be leaders on the statewide coalition, or they're going to provide those administrative needs. Again, in Ohio, the way we did it was I, as a statewide suicide prevention coordinator at the time, I took time and I had it written into my position. I'm going to help get the meeting minutes out. I'm going to provide that administrative support, but that's it. In other states, they actually do have that statewide coordinator who is directed with, as a part of your job, you're going to give 0.25% of your time or whatever else to leading the coalition meetings every single month. And it just differs from one state to another. Either way, what is important, of course, is that your statewide coalition has connections with those staff. And sometimes you might just have staff coming to the meetings and listening in, but you want those staff getting that feedback and guidance from the coalition members. Continuing on beyond that, when we look at LEAD, it had this concept of wanting to establish formal connections between our government agencies. And coalitions really do play key roles here because they give us the opportunity to do that. So we can give our government agencies the opportunity to come together, sit on the coalition, and form those connections that are needed for suicide prevention to not just exist within that LEAD agency, but to really be shared across the state, across the different agencies. And so something that I have seen, we did not do this in Ohio, but something that I've seen has been cool in other states is that they've actually been able to have shared ownership and leadership of their statewide coalitions with different government agencies. For example, in Connecticut, they have a tri-chair model of leadership for their coalition, and it says that their directors of some of their different agencies have to serve in leadership roles, whoever that director is. And so 2 of those tri-chair leaders currently are their Department of Mental Health as well as their Department of Education. So 2 agencies that they see as having key roles in suicide prevention that share that ownership and leadership. And then beyond whether or not you have government agencies being in these leadership roles, we know that if we have it written into the bylaws that our government agencies need to be involved doing X, Y, and Z, that can give that formal connection even if they're not leading it. And so it's important to make sure that that occurs, but it's also important to make sure that in this site on we want to have our government agencies involved, we're not diminishing the role of private agencies in our coalition. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to partner. The last aspect of LEAD is around safe messaging and also just how we communicate on suicide prevention to our state. And so when we think about this, coalitions really, again, can be super helpful in achieving it. So when it comes to LEAD, we know that coalition members can help promote any statewide campaigns that are going on because each one of the coalition members has their own networks so they can get information, resources out to. But also coalitions are a great way to get your media representatives involved and at the table and wanting to engage in suicide prevention. You can have your media representatives, whether it's your local newspaper, your news agencies, someone who has a really well-known blog in the area, ask them to sit at the coalition table so that they can be involved in planning for safe messaging, planning on those campaigns, and involved in getting any message you want out to the community effectively. And then, of course, what's important is that regardless of what's being done with campaigns or not being done with campaigns in your state, you want to make sure that your coalition members are communicating a common vision, mission, and goals for suicide prevention within their own different community sectors. So there's not differing messages going on and what's important about suicide prevention in the state, what you're focusing on. Everyone has that common understanding and they're communicating it to their own communities effectively. All right. And then the last part is partner. And of course, like I said, partner is the development of a statewide coalition. You're not going to achieve it if you don't have a statewide coalition in place. And so when it comes to partner, I kind of hinted at this earlier, but there is a lot of importance on making sure that our public and our private agencies have an equal voice and an equal footing at the coalition. And so to go back to that Connecticut example I talked about earlier, they have that tri-chair model, as I said, and 2 of their chairs are public agencies always, but they also have it written into their bylaws that their 3rd chair is always from a private agency or a nonprofit. And right now that 3rd chair is United Way in their state, but it's a way to make sure that they're giving an equal voice to both the public and the private sides. Now, when it comes to this, we've talked about it a lot. We want our statewide coalition members through their discussions to be developing shared ownership and vision for suicide prevention in the state. This means we need to have regular, consistent, and effective meetings where people feel like they can talk and share their voices. And then a key thing that we want to see happen over time is that our statewide coalition is giving benefits to the members who are a part of that coalition. And so depending on the funding, the resources that you have to your coalition, this of course changes and is dependent on so many things. But every coalition can and should provide guidance on what protocols and policies the different community sectors can be putting in place around suicide prevention. That's something that costs almost next to nothing. But when we get funding in place, it can be useful for us to also think about how those different community sectors that are represented are being given trainings or resources from our statewide coalition, or even given funding opportunities. You put out a RFP that says your community sectors can engage in strategic planning around suicide prevention, et cetera. All things that we can strive to achieve over the long term. And something that is really important, though, I talked about this a little bit earlier, is that coalition members have to commit to a statewide coalition. One of the things that can really lead to coalitions not being effective is having constant transitions of who the coalition members are, where someone comes to a meeting from an agency and then it's someone completely different the next month and someone completely different the next month, and there's really no continuity. So we want to make sure that we are asking the agencies to have officials coming and attending the statewide coalition to commit. And that might be through bylaws where it says if you're a part of this coalition, you're expected to attend X number of meetings every year. It might say you're expected to serve in at least one subcommittee. It might be that you're asked to just sign something saying you're committed to it. But we want to make sure we have something in place to make sure people are committed. And formal elections for leadership roles can be a really effective way to make sure that the people who are most committed end up leading the Suicide Prevention Coalition. All right, so that's really, in a nutshell, how we look at coalitions playing key roles in the development of infrastructure. And hopefully what you're taking away from there is that coalitions really are key. We can focus on authorize and lead, but we really want to be focusing on them as we're developing that statewide coalition at the same time. So kind of what I have to wrap up before I go to just some Q&A is looking at just some common questions that we'll want to be prepared to answer within our own states. And I want to emphasize that I'm not going to give any answers here as to what the right or wrong answers are. You probably get tired of hearing me say that, but really what's right and wrong to answering these does differ from one state to another, and we see a lot of different things across the U.S. The first question that I have here is, who is the authorized lead agency who's going to be providing administrative backing? And you guys might have already figured that out in Kansas. You might already be like, it's KDADS, we're cool, or you might not be to that place yet. Either way, it's important to keep in mind that there are implications to who your lead agency is. If, for example, you have a lead agency that's the Department of Mental Health, your coalition will be perceived a little bit differently than if you have your lead agency be a Department of Public Health or if you use a tri-chair model. So there are implications that are important to keep in mind. Another important thing to think about is whether or not you do want to have paid staff supporting the coalition. It always sounds nice to have paid staff supporting a coalition because they have it written in. They're going to have to make time to do the work because they have it as a part of their position. A drawback that I have heard from people and that I have experienced personally is that sometimes work that you would like the wider coalition doing ends up falling on those staff who have it as a part of their paid time. And so it's just something to be aware of as you're thinking about the implications of, again, having paid staff. Another question area that you'll want to grapple with is how are you going to connect with other related prevention areas? I saw this chat going on about some other related state level groups already. And it's important to think through, how are we going to connect with them? How are we going to make sure that those other statewide committees or groups that are out there aren't working on similar or almost the same projects that we're working on and we're just repeating efforts? Is it going to be that we just have representatives from those different groups in our coalition? Is it going to be that we more formally try to keep each other updated? But it's something important because there's nothing that is more frustrating, at least what I have experienced, than finding out after you've been working on something for 6 months that there was another group doing almost the same thing and you could have been pulling together resources and funding for it. All right, and then the other thing here is, what are our bylaws, policies, and procedures going to be? I put this in here because bylaws are so foundational to the success and the sustainability of a coalition. And a lot of times it kind of gets pushed to the side. We say we got our group together, we're going to start working on stuff, and we don't really realize we needed bylaws until we've been doing a coalition for 6 months or a year. But bylaws can really be helpful in just explicitly saying, hey, if you're a part of this group, this is what the expectations are, this is what we want from you, and this is how often we're going to meet. If you're going to be a part of our coalition, be prepared to come to X number of these meetings, etc. And bylaws also really can be helpful in addressing the next question, which is, how are we going to ensure membership is equitable? When I kind of took a look at your agenda, it looks like you're already prepared to start having discussions around this on who needs to be at the table. I think what I want to emphasize here is that when it comes to looking at equity in statewide coalitions, or any coalition for that matter, it can be really easy to say, we put out a call and we said whoever wants to be involved gets to be involved, so we're done. The problem with that is that you might have key community sectors that don't respond, that don't get represented. And so it takes intentional effort, intentional outreach to go to some of our hard to reach community sectors who incidentally often tend to have the higher suicide rates and incidentally tend to also be having increasing suicide rates right now, and to really ask them what would make them want to be a part of our group and how to get them involved. It takes that active outreach, and it's well worth the investment to do it. And then the next thing I have here is, can we play a role in advocacy or lobbying? This really does differ from state to state. In some states, they have statewide coalitions who do this. In some states, they stay as far away from it as possible because they have public funding going and supporting their statewide coalitions, so they can't. I think what I would just kind of emphasize here, because really this is going to come whether or not you can do this from your funding streams and who your leaders are, but even if you can't engage in advocacy because it doesn't seem appropriate based on where your funding for your coalition is coming from, your coalition still has the ability to give whoever can engage in advocacy data, input on what the actual needs are for suicide prevention in your state. And so, for example, to go back to like my personal experiences, our coalition stayed away from advocacy, but we had NAMI Ohio who did a lot of advocacy in our state. And so we would let them know, these are what we have identified as the major goals, the major needs that we have. Can you please share this message in an appropriate way? All right, and then I have another slide here with some questions that I say are more long-term. It's not necessarily that they're more long-term, but it's really that these questions and how we answer them here, I really see as influencing how we answer these ones. So first, there's this question of, what is our mission, vision, and purpose going to be? It's not that you don't want to be discussing that now, but who is sitting on your coalition, where your coalition is housed, all of that is really going to influence what your mission and vision and purpose end up being. And you really don't want to decide what your vision and purpose is until you have that equitable group to inform that decision. And then I'm not going to read everything underneath this. I have here what will be our projects of focus. That is based on what your mission and vision are. There's a lot of different things coalitions do over the long term. The three I have highlighted there are the three that we see as being deeply connected to the development of state suicide prevention infrastructure. And then lastly, what I have here is, how are we going to ensure sustainability of our coalition? And I put this here just as a question. It's an ongoing thing. There's a lot of ways to answer this. Bylaws do contribute to sustainability, but I would also just emphasize that if you have a coalition where the members are coming, they're feeling heard, they're feeling like they're contributing to something, your coalition naturally is going to sustain itself. A coalition kind of naturally disintegrates if members aren't feeling like they're spending their time well being there. So that's kind of what I have. Any questions And I do have a couple resources I want to briefly highlight, but that will take me like a minute. So before I do that, I'm happy to field any questions there might be. All right, I see a question here on regarding membership equity. Do you have youth actively engaged in your statewide coalition in Ohio? If so, how have you helped them feel comfortable being active participants? That is a great question. And so, unfortunately, I can say that at the time when I was at Ohio, because we were forming the statewide coalition for the first time, we did not yet have a youth subcommittee, but I can share what I have seen other coalitions do. And what a lot of coalitions have done is they do form a subcommittee that's made up of youth and young adults. And usually they have some kind of application process where youth who want to get involved get an opportunity to apply. They don't just go out and pick out certain youth. And then another key thing that I've seen for the coalitions that do that really well is that they usually have the role that they have some adult leader who leads those youth discussions that has a social work or a counseling background, because usually if youth are interested in the Suicide Prevention Coalition, there's a personal reason. They're there to support the youth if anything sensitive comes up or a youth needs supported. And so it's that idea of having that subcommittee where it's not just one youth alone, and also making sure that you have adults there who can support them and make sure that the conversations are being used well. And one of the key things that I've seen coalitions do with youth subcommittees, I don't like the way I phrased that, but one key thing I've seen coalitions do that works well with youth subcommittees is having them involved in the state planning process so they can talk about what they'd like to see when it comes to youth in the suicide prevention plan in particular. But obviously there's more that could be done as well. All right. I saw a comment from Shireen, I think, there, but it doesn't look like it's necessarily a question. And I like your comment, though, on meeting with other subcommittees so I know how to blend and set goals. That's so important. All right. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, what I will do really quick is I just want to highlight some resources that I have. All right. So some state infrastructure tools that we have for you from the Suicide Prevention Resource Center. This right here is just a screenshot of our homepage. If you go to sprc.org, when you're on our homepage at sprc.org, if you click on the Effective Prevention menu header, there's a state infrastructure drop-down list over here. You can click on that, and that will take you to all of our state infrastructure recommendations as well as supporting tools for them. And so what I wanted to emphasize there is that when it comes to our state infrastructure tools, I encourage you to explore all of them. We have a recommendations and related product section. This gives you PDFs of the recommendations. So instead of on the website where you have to click through the recommendations, if, for example, you're trying to give a nice printout that's a summary of the recommendations to your state leaders, you can get a PDF of them here. There's also a tools for implementation section. This has a lot of worksheets that can guide you as you are building infrastructure that have been developed just for that purpose. Andy and some of the others who have been involved in the COP have gotten to see what these look like. They can be really helpful. And then lastly, we have a For Champions section, and this one really has PowerPoint slides on state infrastructure. It has speaking points on state infrastructure that you can use yourself within your own conversations, especially if you're wanting to go out and talk to your state leaders about the importance of infrastructure in your state. All right, and then the other thing I wanted to highlight about this state infrastructure content is that if you go to our website, there are a ton of examples. And so I tried to bring up some examples as they came to me throughout today. But if you go to this website, within each recommendation, there's an example from a state on how they've achieved that recommendation. So you get that real world picture of what it looks like. And then we also have these state infrastructure success stories. These success stories are longer. They're about a page in length, and they look at how a state has achieved an entire essential element. Four that I would encourage you to really take a look at are highlighted in blue here. And those four all really do a great job at demonstrating the role that their coalitions played in developing infrastructure related to some of the different essential elements. So some great examples of coalition work in these four. All right, and then it looks like the PDFs have been put in the chat for me, which is awesome. Thank you, Janelle. I just wanted to share with you that SPRC has a ton of resources in coalition development. We also have a ton of resources of state suicide prevention planning. And so we have these 2 PDFs with links to content related to both of those areas. Every single link is going to take you to stuff that's free. Nothing's going to cost anything, so it's worth taking a look at them. And it's all evidence-informed and up-to-date information as well. So with that all being said, just a reminder, go to SPRC. We have a lot of great resources, and even though I've talked about state infrastructure and coalitions here, we have a ton of stuff just on suicide prevention in general, so I encourage you to check our website out. And that's really all I have. I will just kind of leave you with a note that as part of my job, am supposed to support states and communities. So if as you're going through things you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm never not going to respond to an email. It's a part of my job. I usually make it a point to respond to an email within 24 hours. So do feel free to reach out to me with questions. I've had states who have sent me versions of state plans and things like that for feedback. So don't hesitate. I'm there and I'm happy to provide support. So that's all that I have. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you, Shauna. And can you go ahead and put your email in the chat box so anyone can copy that over to their desktop?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, thank you. And we are going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break. So we will get started again at 3:15.
Before we break, real quick, Janelle, can I say something? Okay, so before we break, I put in the chat, I think I've put it in there already. Yeah, let me send it. But I put in the chat a link to the, hasn't sent yet. So I'll figure that out. But I'm gonna put, there it is, in the chat. There is a link to the draft state suicide prevention plan that was sent out in the emails. And then also a link to the feedback survey. We'd like to gather as much feedback information as we can on the state plan in its current draft form. So there's a link there, and it's also been shared in the email, so you still have it outside of this meeting. But we'd like to get some feedback on the state plan draft by October 1. And so I'll be sharing a little bit more about the state plan when we come back from the break. Those are a couple of links then that they may be useful for you during the meeting, during my part. Also, the other thing that I wanted to say is when we come back, I'm going to invite you all to take a group photo to step into the Kansas Prevention Collaborative Zoom photo studio. And I'd invite you to turn your webcams on. If you have webcams and you're willing and able, I'll take a screenshot and share that on the KPC Facebook. If we don't have your consent to share your picture of your webcam on the Kansas Prevention Collaborative Facebook page, please turn your cameras off, and we'll make sure and send me a note if you want your name removed or anything like that, so we have your consent to share things after we come back from the break. So what time did you say, Janelle, we're coming back?
3:15.
Okay, let's come back at 3:17 since I took 2 minutes. Okay, so I'm getting ready to take a picture. So again, if I have your consent to take your photo from your webcam, it will be a Zoom Brady Bunch type picture, and then I will share it on the Kansas Prevention Collaborative Facebook page. And if I don't have your consent to share that picture on there, please turn your cameras off. And if you don't want your name shared at all, send me a private message or an email or a message for all to see. But I have the camera in position to take a few pictures. And I've got to scroll, we've got large groups, so I've got to scroll between screens. So I'll take a few, but I'll count down from 3, and I'll do 3, 2, 1, picture. And then I'll do that again, 3, 2, 1, picture, and I'll do that again, and then we'll be done. Okay. Yeah, look at all of us. Okay, 3, 2, 1, picture, picture, 3, 2, 1, picture, and then scroll. Okay, 3, 2, 1, picture, It's hard to say picture and smile. Picture. Okay, that's it for the photos. Thank you very much.
I like the hopping up and down. That helped.
Who was hopping?
You.
Was I hopping? Oh, okay.
You're like picture.
Okay.
Cute.
Sorry about that. Okay. So yeah, I'm really excited to see you all, and I've got a lot of things to share, but I'm not going to share them because you have the documents to review later. But I'm really excited about this. I'm glad that we're at this point. And so some of what we've been sharing are some of the reasons why we're here to talk about the coalition. The coalition has not been developed with a mindset of this is going to be the suicide prevention coalition in Kansas, or this is going to tell all the other suicide prevention coalitions what to do. It's not set up to be that at all. It really is how can we get a better idea of what's going on in the state and share that and help have the coalitions, the local coalitions, make this coalition stronger and vice versa. How can we help have this coalition make the local coalition stronger too? So we want to try to connect all of the great expertise and resources that we have across the state and move forward with this coalition, which will be formed and we'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. But we're gonna try to design this really well with the input from you all, from experts. So partners in the state of Kansas are really committed to this, and you can tell already from some of the state departments and offices represented here today. The State Prevention Coalition, the plan, really kind of identified the coalition as one of its main goals, that this needs to exist. So the plan for the State Suicide Prevention Plan update that we've just been going through and that you have a draft that you've received in emails and then links in the chat, it has to demonstrate multi-sector partnerships working through a variety of settings. It has to demonstrate continued and improved data collection to identify and prioritize vulnerable populations, as well as risk and protective factors that impact those populations. It must use evidence-based initiatives to address suicide prevention, must evaluate the approaches and activities to support continuous improvement and sustained impact, and it must have effective communications tying it all together. And so behavioral health services housed at KDADS, Kansas Department for Aging and Disability Services, made a lot of strides in building some public and private partnerships throughout the years. And we want to connect those with the efforts that have been going on through the Governor's Behavioral Health Services Planning Council and the Prevention Subcommittee, Kansas Department of Health and Environment, or KDHE, Kansas Suicide Prevention HQ, Keys for Networking, the Office of Attorney General, Kansas Prevention Collaborative, Kansas Consumer Advisory Council, Department of Ed, NAMI Kansas, Department of Agriculture, Department of Children and Families, and the Commission on Veteran Affairs. We've also connected with Association of Community Mental Health Centers of Kansas and individuals and families with lived experience, including those with suicidal ideation, attempt survivors, and the suicide loss survivors. We also connected with local suicide prevention coalitions, and that's got us to this point of where we're wanting to share how the coalition fits in some ways with the plan, and we want to have the plan fit in some ways with the coalition and as it forms. So the plan that I'm going to be previewing, sharing with you just an overview, really is intended to be effective for 2021 through 2025, and it is intended to outline the activities and responsibilities necessary to accomplish suicide prevention goals and objectives across the human lifespan, across the life course. So I'll share with you some slides. It's meant to be a guide for future priorities and decisions for the state of Kansas during the next 5 years. The plan addresses 4 strategic directions and related goals and objectives, and those are healthy and empowered individuals, families, and communities, clinical and community preventive services, treatment and support services, surveillance, research, and evaluation. So those are the 4 strategic directions. And I'm going to give you I'm going to skim through these directions. I'm not going to read all the words on the slides. You have it in the link to the plan, and you can read there, and there will be a lot more words because it's 50 pages, which is good. It seems like a lot, but we had to figure out how to put all that we wanted to capture into this document to make it really useful. So strategic plan, the direction 1 is healthy and empowered individuals. And you can see there are goals related to that. The first goal was, and I went too far too fast, integrate and coordinate suicide prevention activities across multiple sectors and settings. And you'll see objective 1.1.1 is establish a statewide suicide prevention coalition. And so that's part of why it's incredible to me that we're here today and getting this going. It's really exciting. Goal 2 is to strengthen and broaden public communication efforts about risk and protective factors for suicide. Strategic direction 2, clinical and community preventive services. So this is more in the treatment area of the state and goal 1 is to target suicide prevention efforts by learning about and providing populations with heightened risk and or behavioral health disparities with service and resources that will meet their needs. Goal 2 is support local efforts to reduce access to local means. Strategic direction 3, treatment and support services here is the first goal is to promote a standard for suicide related behavioral health care to improve access to services. And you'll see things like zero suicide mentioned here, which is another incredible thing that KDHE has brought to Kansas for us to use moving forward across the state. Goal 2, under that strategic direction, is to increase access to crisis services. This is where throughout the plan, we'll be asking people with lived experience with suicide and suicide related services to help us develop this and make it more effective as a state system. Goal 3 is to support postvention. Strategic direction 4 is surveillance, research, and evaluation. And goal 1 is to improve data collection related to suicide, morbidity, and mortality. So we have lots of data across the state. We need to make best use of our data and get the best data that can help us find out what is going on. Goal 2 is annually review and report on state suicide prevention plans. So for folks that have an interest in evaluation and how can we monitor and track how well we're doing what we're doing, this is where that goal will describe some of the things that the state could do. Goal 3 is evaluate the impact and effectiveness of suicide prevention interventions, systems, and synthesize and disseminate findings. So we're gonna find a way to track how well are we doing the work and how well is it working. So that concludes, goal 2. Yeah. That concludes my part. And I will pause and hope that I was showing the slides that fit with the things that I was saying. But I'll pause and see if anybody has any questions at this point about the state suicide prevention plan or where to find the document to review it and offer your feedback by October 1st.
Chad, can I insert a question via voice? My fat fingers type too slowly.
Yes.
I wonder if it would be smart to put a line in there someplace that would have you advocating and maybe even facilitating promising research areas that may have value. Because I don't think it's good to assume that everything we have now works fine. And there are some things out there that may work very well. And they're under review right now. And if you could advocate for those things, report back on them would help.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And that's definitely something that we could include is some reference to the more promising practices. If they haven't gone through that research, it's okay. We need to find what works and how to share what works.
Okay.
All right. So if anybody has any other questions, please go ahead and type them into the chat or send them to kpcteam@wichita.edu or use the feedback form online. But thank you very much for the time. I'm excited to be here and I'm excited for what's next.
All right, thanks, Chad. And when we send the follow-up email with the PowerPoint and all, we will include the draft and the link for the feedback form again. So you will get that a second time. All right, so I am actually already seeing this happen in the chat a little bit, which is really exciting because you guys already are on top of it and know what is coming next. But let's talk about maybe who's not in the room right now and who needs to be invited. So thinking back to when we all introduced ourselves in the chat at the very beginning, and there were lots of different organizations and subcommittees and coalitions that are already represented today, or were invited, and Chad read off some different groups that are already involved. But go ahead and either type in the chat, or if you want to share out loud, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to share any type of, whether it's an organization, a group of people, age range. I know Chrissy already asked about youth involvement with Shauna, and Charlie shared something in the chat. I know that Kansas School Mental Health Advisory Council was mentioned in the chat. So I'm gonna pause and be quiet. And we want to hear from you guys of who you think is currently missing. Thanks, Gina. Gina put in the chat box, families touched by suicide. Definitely, Stephanie, thank you. Tribes, LGBTQ, diverse individuals of color. Again, organizations supporting LGBTQ+, attempt survivors and consumers. AFSP is a great group to get family involvement. Thanks, Andy. All right, continue sharing groups, but I also want to move into thinking about individual people that you guys know in Kansas. And if you have somebody, an individual that you can think of that you think would be a really great addition to the coalition, and you have their contact information, go ahead, and if you don't feel comfortable putting their contact information in the chat, you can private message that to either myself or Chad in the chat, or you can email us at kpcteam@wichita.edu, and I'll type that email in the chat as well. So like Shauna was saying during her presentation, it's important to have intentional effort to include all groups. We want to really have an intentional effort at including groups that aren't on the typical mailing list for suicide prevention information. So continue, even though we're going to move on to the next speaker, I want you guys to continue. There's some really great ideas being put in the chat, so thank you. Yes, Gina asked if we can share the listing. We can definitely share the ideas that came up. All right, perfect. Stephanie, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, well, great. Well, first of all, thank you all for hanging in there with us. I'm still seeing about 32 people, and you all came back from break, so thank you so much, and good afternoon. Again, my name is Stephanie Reinhart. For those who don't know me, I am the Prevention Program Manager and also the Interim State Suicide Coordinator, Prevention Coordinator at KDADS. We've been talking about how important it is to have a 100% full-time coordinator, and so we are actively working on that, but for now, it's me. But I am so excited to speak with you today about this part of our work. Whether I have been working in direct services or administrative type roles in human services or social services, the one thing that I've learned is that there is just something about seeing people connect, organize, and collaborate to get important things done, especially processes that save lives. And if you've been in a meeting with me or heard me talk, I'm always going to preach that message. So to lead this critical group, KDADS will provide backbone support to get the coalitions up and running, and will support a leadership group that, as Andy mentioned, is called the Steering Committee. And the purpose of the Kansas Suicide Prevention Coalition Steering Committee is to develop and facilitate the leadership of the Kansas Suicide Prevention Coalition, which we've been talking about today. And the Kansas Suicide Prevention Coalition connects other Kansas suicide prevention groups, coalitions, and organizations across the state of Kansas in a collaborative effort to make positive change, which is why you all are here. And the steering committee will determine how often and through which format to meet. The steering committee has the critical role of helping to decide how suicide prevention professionals would be best served in this connection opportunity, including setting the foundation for topics of focus and suggesting resources and activities. So the role of the State Suicide Prevention Coalition Steering Committee is to keep coalition members engaged, to consult with facilitators on agenda planning, ensure the right people are involved and are at the table, to help create organizational documents and make decisions about coalition structure. And the facilitators from WSU's Community Engagement Institute will make sure everything is running smoothly, just like they've done today. And the steering committee will advise WSU about meeting logistics, but will not be responsible for those things like reservations, invitations, those logistic type items that we don't always have time for. They will be there to assist you and to facilitate all of the meetings. So our initial plan is that members of the steering committee will serve 2-year terms, and without setting a real goal for an exact maximum of number of members, our goal would be that we have a few members staying on each year to offer experience and a continuity, and that we also have new members that are joining each new year that comes about. So as I stated, and as we've stated before, the steering committee will meet as frequently and through whichever format they decide as far as the meeting schedule and the structure. And this may adapt over time because this is something that we want to sustain. And all the members will be involved in conversations regarding any of those planned change. So I'd like us to take a look at the steering committee letter of interest. And we also will be distributing this to those who are interested and express an interest in becoming a member of the steering committee. We like the membership to be inclusive and valuable experience for those with both lived experience, reflect a balance and diversity, and bring a beneficial approach and perception to suicide prevention and treatment in the state of Kansas. So if you're interested, which I hope you are, in serving on the steering committee, please send a completed letter of interest form to the KPC team at wichita.edu by October 1st. I know that's quick, but I hope that today, as you've been participating in this meeting, that you have gotten as excited as I am and that you're ready to sign up. So again, that's KPC team at wichita.edu by October 1st. And thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being here today.
So can you email the letter out to those that are participating? For those of us that are not technically qualified to copy this and send it to our emails?
We can definitely do that, Gary.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Gina, I think we are passing it over to you.
Good. I had to unmute myself. Thank you so much. I hope by now you all are as excited about this as I feel like those of us who've been working at it internally for a while have been and are. I really feel like it's things are coming together, that we've dedicated a lot of resources to trying to make sure we're communicating, and that this is really kind of cementing the next step to take us and move us forward, and to really keep the focus where it should be, and bring the additional resources that we all know are needed into our state. So I'm super, super excited to be part of this process. I think most of you know, but I am about a year ago, I was appointed as the Youth Suicide Prevention Coordinator. And even though I feel like we've come so far, I feel like there's still so much to do. And this is really an important process. And I'm excited to get our folks together and get a group of folks dedicated to looking at youth suicide, and those who've already been working at it, and will strengthen our work related to this moving forward and our communication. So this is such a critical piece for us to lay the foundation and really cement it for years to come. So obviously the state agencies and offices have been working hard and sharing resources, not only about preventing suicide, but really about improving the lives of all Kansans. You guys know that one suicide is one too many, and we're invested in that. And I think that's what this really shows, is that we're invested in making sure Kansans are thriving and surviving, and really want to have reason to live. So that's the goal, is that we will bring resources to many folks who are still hurting and help. And so I'm very excited about that. I hope you're leaving energized by the passion and expertise and the work that's gone on to date. Maybe some of it you knew, maybe some of it you didn't know. So hopefully you feel good about what's transpired, but you also feel challenged about what lies ahead for all of us, and that you want to be part of that process. We know we need everyone at the table, and we know that it's going to take all of us working together to prevent suicide. We know there are many, many folks in our communities, whether it's our veterans or our farmers or our college students, our young people. Certainly right now with the pandemic going on, we know there are a lot of people hurting and needing help. And it's, that's what this is all about, is sharing those resources and trying to get out to those folks in all parts of our state and get the resources and the help out that folks need in order to feel like there's a desire to be here. So we want you to be part of the Coalition Steering Committee, and I think Stephanie laid out how you can do that. So I know I think they put the link up in the chat box. So hopefully you have that and you want to be part of the process. So kind of how it's going to work is the steering committee will be formed after being notified of member selection decisions within the next month. And once you're notified, this leadership group will initially meet in a way that's safe. I guess it's going to depend on what's happening with the COVID and the illness, but we'll figure out a way to meet. And WSU, I think Stephanie already said, WSU is going to continue to be involved and support KDADs and support the subgroups as we try to move this forward. And we'll figure out the format. And then, sorry, my nose is going to start running. The steering committee will be supported by the Kansas Statewide Suicide Prevention Coalition also. So if you're interested, please go to the KPC team at wichita.edu to say that you're interested. Any questions we can answer for anybody before, I know Janelle's going to take over and she'll do a better job, but it's been a great privilege to be part of working with so many of you on this issue, and I'm excited about where we're headed.
Yeah, and Gina, I'm just going to add one thing, which is that I want everybody to know that the steering committee, we're planning on having the steering committee meet for about a year, and then coming back next September, we're hoping to have a big kickoff, almost cattle call type event where we invite everybody who's involved in suicide prevention to come and learn about the decisions that the steering committee group has made and about how we've structured the coalition and how they can be a member of it.
Thank you, Andy.
Awesome. Thank you, Gina and Andy. Go ahead, and if you have any questions, not just about what Gina and Stephanie may have just shared about the steering committee, but about anything that was talked about during today's meeting, you can go ahead and type those in the chat. I just put the steering committee letter of interest in the chat, but again, we'll email that out to everybody so you have it. And we'll also put the email kpcteam@wichita.edu in that email. For anybody who was not able to join right away at 2 p.m. or joined a little late for whatever reason, again, this meeting is recorded and we're able to share that. And so if you want to watch the part of the meeting that you were unable to be present for, or fast forward and watch Shauna's presentation again to take it all in, you can definitely do that with the recording. There is a question on any limitations on number of representations from one agency.
So I will say that we're going to use a matrix to try and make sure that we're identifying people from different areas around the state, both regionally and also with different sectors. And so it may depend a little bit on how broad the scope of your agency is in terms of how many people might be able to be on that steering committee. But then when we get to the point where we're having full coalition meetings next year, there would not be a limit on the number of representatives from any one agency. And we're just basically doing that to make sure that we've got, equal representation for the steering group decisions.
All right, the estimate for the size of the steering committee overall.
Andy, go ahead.
No, you can answer it. Go for it.
Oh, well, like we mentioned, we're not going to put a maximum on it at this time. As Shauna talked about, we went through our infrastructure planning and we are at ground level. So you all are at the ground level with us. And so we are going to do our best with the best enthusiasm that we have and kind of work things through. As Andy mentioned, we are going to have a matrix. So I'm not really sure that we're looking so much as the maximum as we're looking at the commitment, as Shauna mentioned, of the 2 years, looking at maybe people after the first year, maybe some stick around after the 2 years, maybe some stick around and then we get some new members. And we keep it going for years to come. But we haven't yet set any maximum on how many individuals are going to be in the steering committee. And I think that that's going to just come by our continued conversations. We hope we have too many people. I hope we have too many people.
Any other questions? And Chad, if you want to go ahead and go to the contact page, just so if anybody wants to email someone directly, they have those emails.
And just to fill time, I really am looking forward to seeing the feedback. I know this meeting is not about our state plan, but many of you on this meeting worked on the state plan, and there was a lot of work put in by a lot of individuals who really have a passion for this work and a passion for Kansans and healthy living of Kansans and safe living. And we really value your feedback, because there are some on this meeting who may not have been on that committee, but who we very much so value your opinion because you have a different perspective in our community. So please, if you have the time to review that and provide any feedback, we really look forward to seeing that from you.
All right, I'm not seeing any additional questions, but I am still seeing ideas about groups and people to include. So do keep submitting those. If you think of a group later tonight while you're cooking dinner, email us and let us know and we'll add it to the list. All right, are there any final words that anybody, Commissioner Brown or Gina, any of you guys want to share before closing up?
Yeah, I would just like to thank everybody for taking the time out of your schedules today to be here. We sent our invite out to, I think, like about 120 people total, Chad, right? So all of those people have been individuals that have worked on some type of suicide prevention planning in our state over the last maybe 2-3 years. And, I feel like some of you I know really well, and some of you I have met and worked with on projects, but I'm looking forward to us being in a position where we're able to build on those relationships and really kind of strengthen the networking that we've begun over the last couple of years. And so I'm super excited about this. I know Gina is, and we're, our partners over at KDHE are, I think, also very excited about the work that we've been doing and the progress that we're making on this issue. I know that oftentimes it feels like suicide prevention is sort of an overwhelming topic here in our state and how we can try to address it. And that's part of the reason I'm really excited about these guidelines from SPRC, is because it does give us a good roadmap that we can start trying to follow and implement here in our state, and at least put that kind of those best practices in play as we're moving forward. So I'm looking forward to it, and I'm optimistic about what that'll mean for our future.
The only thing I guess I would add is thank you, Chad and Janelle, for your leadership and guiding us through the discussion today. And thanks again to all of you for participating and who've been involved for months and years on this topic. It's I feel like we're at a crossroads, and it's a great thing it's a great day to be a Kansan and be working on this issue.
All right, I think that's all we have today. So again, thank you. We will be sending out a follow-up email with the resources and PowerPoints that were shared today.
Thank you all very much. Good to see you.